changers. Welcome to another episode of the How to Save the World podcast, where we'll be learning how to turn your dreams for a better world into real and measurable change. And I have the wonderful job of being able to interview some of the world's most interesting people in the fields of data science, psychology, and game design. Today's guest on the show is Dietmar Offenhuber. He is an assistant professor of art and design and public policy at Northeastern University in Boston. He has recently published a book called Waste is Information: Infrastructure, Legibility, and Governance, which has come out of a project he worked on at MIT called the Trash Track Project that involved sticking little electronic GPS sensors on regular items of garbage and seeing what happened to it all. We are going to be talking about high-tech garbage and why it is so important to gather detailed data about all the stuff we throw away that is all too often forgotten about. So thank you so much for joining me today, Dietmar. I am just so excited to have you on the show. Could we start by you just explaining what is a smart city to people who don't know what that term is?
Hi, Katie. Yeah, very glad to be on the show. Thank you. Smart city, there are many words, and also smart city can mean many different things. But basically, there's a lot of interest in using technology to make the city more legible, to get a better understanding what is going on in the city, in all of its infrastructures, in order to figure out how can we improve the city, both in terms of its technical, but also its human and social processes. I would say I'm not necessarily subscribed to the smart city paradigm, but I'm very much interested in technologies and cities.
Yeah, well, it's a nice kind of like catch-all phrase, I think, to just cover. I see it as just meaning more data and more sensors and more understanding. And I wanted to ask you, in the blurb about your book, you talked about this problem of cities being opaque. What is the big problem that we have with cities at the moment when we don't have data? What are we suffering from?
So I'm coming originally from urban design, and in urban design, there's this notion of urban legibility. A legible city is the city that we can find our way in without the map. It's a classical question for urban designers to figure out how to design a city so that it's legible. Surprisingly, this has not been considered for infrastructure, if we basically, beyond transportation infrastructure, of course. But infrastructure and public services such as waste systems, they make up such a big part of our cities. They are not really designed to be legible, so we don't really have a lot of information about how they work, what is going on. But of course, this doesn't mean that it's not important, because everyone has an opinion about waste systems. And I'm really interested in how we can make waste systems more legible.
It sounds to me what you mean by this concept of urban legibility, that we have visual maps, right? Like we can look at Google Maps or maps that have sort of latitude and longitude. Well, we kind of understand the X, Y, Z of the physical world of mapping. But when it comes to all the movements of everything, of people, of matter, of trash, for example, which is sort of a large amount of stuff going in and out, if we're not tracking this, we just have no concept of the flow of anything on top of this map, right?
This specifically with waste systems, this is exactly the problem, because traditionally waste systems are municipal responsibility, so they're very fragmented. Every city has a different system. They categorize waste differently, so all these things are a little bit incompatible with each other. So a lot of waste scholars have written about this central role of categorization. At the same time, the waste system is global. It's very complex and involves many social and economic and environmental and political aspects. Of course, the lead longs are one part of it, but there are so many more aspects to these socio-technical systems that are hidden.
In the future, we might have these cities which have all of this detailed information, say about, for example, garbage. What would, in the best scenario, this type of future that we'd be going towards be like? I mean, what would it feel like being in this type of smart city, for use of a better word, when we'd have all this information? I mean, why should we care about going in this direction?
If you think about the example of waste systems, everyone sees, every different actor sees it as a different kind of problem. homeowners or residents, it's like an aesthetic problem. They don't want to see trash in front of their street. Officials or social scientists, it might be a public health problem. It might be a problem of environmental justice. For engineers, it's a technical problem. So there are all these kind of different perspectives. Each of these groups have their own way of representing and measuring these systems. So of course, those different representations don't always show the same picture. So there's a negotiation going on, and what problems are most important? Is this aesthetic problem more important than the public health problem? Usually it's the other way around. So, but you get this sense that it's a constant negotiation through these kind of different maps and data sets that we collect about the city. And talking about the future, I think it's more about coming up with a way to talk about these systems that is a little bit more in line with how these systems actually work today and not how they worked, let's say, 50 or 60 years ago, because we still talk about urban infrastructure in a way that we pretend that there's one central authority who builds these systems, who runs them and who maintains them, and it's all a very binary structure. But in reality, it's all very complex and there are a lot of different actors involved. And this is not really captured in the way how we talk about and measure these systems.
Because the sort of future I see when all this stuff really gets off the ground is that we'll be able to develop real-time feedback loops and really look into any particular system and then kind of dramatically optimize it in a way that we can't when it's opaque. I kind of see it as being able to just map out all of this data and being able to see all of this low-hanging fruit for change. Be like, we can change that, we can change that, we can change that. Mm-hmm. And then when we can apply these design techniques like color, for example, so simple, but, you look, this is the red zone, everybody knows what the red zone is. Then we'll be able to just improve everything so much. I mean, that's what I see happening. Do you see it going that way?
What you just described is really a perfect example of what I describe as accountability-oriented design, how you can really come up with design of data, of interfaces that helps you get a sense of the governance or your own role in the system, that you get a sense of what's going on in these systems that I'm with my daily life. So for investigative journalists or activists, understanding or getting this kind of information is a very hard problem. During my research, I worked with different groups such as the Basel Action Network, who does a lot of investigation in global e-waste trade. And those investigations are very complicated, and there's really detective work to piece together things. I'm interested in technologies that allow these kind of activists or researchers, also companies and city officials, to have better tools to map out these systems and get a better sense of what happens.
And can you explain in a bit more detail about what you did with the MIT Trash Track project? So you put sensors on just pieces of garbage, right?
So this was in actually almost 8 years ago, 2009, where we at the Sensible City Lab, we attached 3,000 items, 3,000 GPS trackers on garbage items in a way that they can't be separated. So there was a lot of engineering involved in just trying to figure that out, how we can do this. And then we followed those items through the waste system for about 6 months. We tracked objects all over the continent, from Canada to Mexico and from the West Coast to the East Coast. I think it's a very powerful thing, and it inspired me also to follow up projects to look at informal waste systems in Brazil. How does a system work where there is very little formal organization and very little data? And also to these kind of questions of participatory infrastructure governance, like in the US, where you have all these kind of new experiments of how the individual can be more involved.
Another concept I noticed that you bring up in your book is this intersection between technology and policy or governance, which you just alluded to. I mean, what are you starting to see change? Like, for example, with trash, where you're getting this data and then governments can start using it to make better decisions. I mean, what have you seen in regards to that with the Trash Track project?
So the trash truck project created a lot of feedback from a lot of different people. And for me, it was interesting that we had city officials who really wanted to better understand their waste systems. We had inquiries from activists and advocacy groups who wanted to investigate the specific case. I spoke also with the EPA and even with people at Interpol who investigate environmental crimes and who were also very interested. I mean, of course, they use their own tracking methodologies, but they were still very interested in these projects. Big companies in the US also have these problems that they have to work with all these waste management contractors, let's say Nike, or Google, they have waste management contractors. And if those contractors do something illicit, like, if they just throw all the garbage into the river, the company is liable. So there's this concept of strict liability. So they also have an incentive to understand their own reverse logistics, their own waste management practices. And that kind of showed me that this need for more transparent infrastructures is very pervasive, and it's not a top-down versus bottom-up thing, but it's something that concerns almost every actor.
I think what you're saying is that once you actually start putting the data out there, everyone's like, oh my God, I need that. Oh, I really, whoa, can we have some more of this? They're hungry for the information so they can optimize their situation. I mean, what was like the craziest thing that you saw once you could actually see all the trash going all around the country? Was there like an oh my God moment?
I mean, we had a couple of really interesting puzzles, and the analysis of the data was not so straightforward as one might expect. So we wrote algorithms to automatically cluster and identify locations and stuff like that. But in the end, what we had to do is really manually look and interpret every individual trace and figure out what was going on there. Because the data that you get is often a little bit inconclusive. You don't know whether this location is basically en route or whether this was a spot where the waste was sitting for a longer time. So there were a lot of these questions, and we stumbled across a lot of really interesting cases. So for example, we had a couple of printer cartridges that we tracked from pretty much similar locations in Seattle, and they also ended up in the same facility in Mexico. We also saw that the way how they went there was often very different. So one would just go down through California along Interstate 5. But then another one would go first to Chicago and then from Chicago back all the way to California and Mexican border. And we're wondering, so how is this possible? I mean, this looks very erratic. And of course, it looks very inefficient to take the trash first to Chicago from Seattle and then back to Mexico. But then we saw that based on the facilities that we visited along the lines, that this was using a freight train as a transportation mode. And when we did the calculation of the carbon footprint, it was actually more efficient or, used less energy compared to the truck that went the straight direction through California. So the lesson here is really that things are a little bit more complicated than you might imagine. So it's a very interesting landscape where the question of what is the right thing to do with trash is not always so easy to answer.
And did you track both recyclables and non-recyclables?
So we limited ourselves to municipal solid waste and recyclables. So we didn't have industrial waste, for example. We actually had a list of what we were looking for based on a typical composition that a household produces, and there was milk containers, typical newspapers, cardboard, and also batteries, electronics, and regular garbage. So all kinds of different things. I think we didn't include organics because we didn't want to throw the electronic devices. We didn't want them to contaminate the compost stream. But other than that, we pretty much covered all different types.
Once you could see that these supposedly like recycled items went on these really long routes, I mean, did that make you disheartened about recycling? How do you feel about recycling now that you've done this project?
I mean, recycling is a complicated issue because for some materials, for example, cardboard, it's very useful and saves a lot of energy. For glass, it's good because, the glass is not on the street, or, it kind of minimizes the litter problem, but it doesn't really have a big environmental impact either way. For plastic, it's a little bit tricky because just there's so much of it, and it's also difficult to recycle. A lot of that depends on the purity of the material, how well is it sorted. But what really stood out for us was electronics as a quite a big challenge, because it's a very valuable material that potentially could be recycled. There's a lot of value to capture, but at the same time, it's very difficult to collect and very difficult to dismantle, and a lot of things can go wrong if it's informally recycled, and pollution is, and like health impacts become relevant. So that was for us kind of the most interesting challenge, the electronics, cell phones, computers, batteries, and so on.
Well, I've read a bunch of life cycle analysis reports on recycling because I had this suspicion. I just thought, does recycling use up more energy and have a bigger environmental footprint than it gains? On all the reports that I read, I found that wasn't the case. It didn't have a bigger environmental footprint. The environmental saving was really small. If you were to take a plastic bottle and then melt it down, turn it into a new plastic bottle, or a glass, turn it down, make it into a new one, over and over again versus using virgin materials, it just wasn't a big environmental win. And recycling has big environmental costs. Recycling plastic uses up lots of water. You still have to melt it down. You've still got to have trucks. I mean, do you think we should just give up on recycling? I mean, apart from cardboard, like you said, that has benefits, should we just let it go? Is it too much work? Should not enough gain?
Yeah, I mean, when the way how I look at systems is you always have to look at the whole system. And, recycling is really, in some cases, as you say, very problematic if we just, don't look at the way how things are produced. So we cannot solve environmental problems through recycling if we at the same time don't really look at the production of things. So we always have to look at these things together. There's a lot of rhetoric around recycling always being something very positive, which is problematic. And I completely agree with you there. There are a lot of emerging policies of extended producer responsibility, where manufacturers are included in the whole process and also have to bear some of the costs. So of course, those things also face resistance from certain groups, and then recycling becomes a very easy way out to say, well, let's put it all into the responsibility of the individual. I mean, of course, the individual is responsible, but a lot of other actors are also responsible, and sometimes even much more responsible for how the system operates. There are a lot of complicated questions here.
Yeah, I think it's something that often is not necessarily thought about clearly, is this difference between this individual blame psychology versus, maybe blame's not the best word, but an individual focused solution versus a systems focused solution. And it can feel really complicated and blurry when it comes to environment. But I think using an example of a child, in a bad home is a really good way to explain it. That if you have a child who's doing badly at school and they're acting out, we can say, oh, they're just a terrible child. That child's just a bad apple. But if you look at their home life, you can say, well, they're actually at a family that's troubled, and that family is in a situation that's troubled, in a world that's troubled, whatever. And that the child is just a symptom of the whole. I mean, when we bring that into this kind of systems thinking, into sustainability, I mean, how do we need to evolve the way we approach sustainability to sort of get away from this individual blame psychology, more systems theory, but instead kind of not let people off the hook? I mean, what do you think about that?
I mean, this is a very, very good example that you brought. I think there's this rhetoric that in the end, the consumers are the ones who basically determine how the system works, because they buy the products from company A instead of company B. And that in the end, it's pretty much everything is determined by consumer behavior. We all know that in reality, it doesn't work like that at all. The consumer has very little ways of even understanding what is going on. The consumer doesn't really create all the options. They might buy the cheapest thing, yes, maybe, but the way how the whole system is structured is definitely not in the hands of the individual, which of course doesn't mean that the individual is not part of this system. Of course, we are all entangled in it. But I think that those kind of questions are exactly what I meant by these negotiations on the governance level. What you also just described are different ways of reading the system. You can read the system in a way that it all comes down to individual behavior, or you can read the system that it all comes down to kind of, executive decisions by big companies, and how those different viewpoints are negotiated is something that I'm interested in to address through data and through basically open governance and accountability technologies.
I actually put this book together of zero waste tips, 150 zero waste tips. It's something that I personally really care about. And so I put the book out there. It's done well, quite a few people bought it, and it's very much an individual manual. But I kind of lost heart in it a bit because I was always coming from a systems mindedness. I really wanted to develop something that would change the system, but then I realized I had to put something in for the individual. I've heard quite a few people criticize recycling and even criticize the movement to pick up trash off the street. There's something called Clean Up Australia Day and Clean Up the World, and it's actually sponsored by McDonald's. So we could argue that the entire recycling movement is only there to provide a marriage or a panacea to consumerism, to disposable consumerism. And I wrote this in this introduction to say, well, you only need recycling if you have a disposability-based economy. So they're trying to sell it as being this really great way out. But if you don't have a wasteful disposability-based economy, then you don't need recycling. I mean, do you kind of see recycling that way as this kind of almost like a greenwashing of disposable consumerism?
I mean, there's this excellent book by Samantha McBride under the title Recycling Reconsidered, where she traces the history of where did recycling come from. She makes exactly this argument that threat of basically a new tax for manufacturers responded by basically creating these recycling initiatives that would basically shift the whole responsibility to the individual. There are these arguments that this has been an important part. If we look at recycling just more general as a way to capture value from the waste stream, of course this is something that has always happened through history, and it is maybe we mean different things if we say recycling. There might be one way of talking about recycling as these cleanup initiatives sponsored by McDonald's, but there might be also another way to think the concept. So I think at some point just capturing value is an important part of any type of engagement with waste systems. And I actually looked at these kind of waste picker cooperatives in Brazil who got together to collect more material so that they can sell it back to industry as a commodity. The way how they sort and clean these kind of plastic materials reaches such a high quality and such a high purity that would be completely unattainable in a single stream system where all the dirty stuff is just thrown together. They really managed to separate it out and create a very high quality product. So it's very interesting to look at how exactly what exactly happens there. A lot of the problems with recycling are really also related to just the pervasive use of plastic packaging material for pretty much everything. So looking into supply chains and looking into packaging practices and product is very important.
Yeah, and it's really crazy how difficult it is to live without making any trash. If you wanted to take the individualist approach to say, well, I cannot be a part of this system, I mean, it's almost completely impossible. Have you seen those people that just make a jar of trash? Have you seen them? The Bea Johnson, she's like a famous person who does it. I mean, I've done that for little bits of time in my life, kind of like going to the gym every day. Like I've got it down for maybe like 6 weeks at a time, or maybe 3 months when I've been doing really well. But I mean, to function against the kind of laws of the system you're in, it requires enormous commitment and cognitive ability to override all the competing forces. Like what you're saying, the more data that we can gather, the more we can use it to take this systems-wide approach to solving our problems and not get stuck in the individual mindedness too much.
I mean, the data is not going to solve the problem. It's basically just a language to talk about it. It's not a solution. It is to some extent can be changed, but yeah, it's not one solution that gives you everything, solves everything.
What do you think is the hardest thing about getting us to make this leap into this urban legibility, this kind of new world of being able to have this better data, these better decisions, this better policy?
one of the problems that I constantly try to address in the way how we talk about these things is this kind of binary thinking dichotomies. I say, okay, top down versus bottom up, recycling good and landfill bad, and those kind of very simple dichotomies that they make it easy to think about these systems. But unfortunately, everything that is related to infrastructure, and I use the word infrastructure to describe a socio-technical system that a lot of social things and a lot of technical and political things come together, they don't really work that way. And it's always about embracing the messiness of these systems. They are never finished. There's never a kind of, okay, they're in development, but once the system is finished, everything will be fine. That never happens. It's always in progress. To this earlier point of how can what is the role of the individual? A couple of years back, I edited this volume called Accountability Technologies, where I looked at these kind of bottom-up initiatives of activists and organizations who produce data and then try to insert it back into the governance process, into policy. And that doesn't happen magically just by collecting the data, but then you have to make alliances, you have to convince people, you have to establish evidence and find the right groups to work with. All of these things are traditional aspects of governance, political work, but just understanding what is the role of data in this context, that I think is the hard part to crack.
So what I'm hearing is that it's really almost a mindset. So you're not saying there's one corporation that's completely against us. There's one political party that's completely against us. It's people's selfishness or greed. I mean, I mention them because they're commonly what people say why is the world the way it is? But you're saying it's really getting everyone who's involved in this system, getting their consciousness around just the complexity, and that there's not one right answer, and there's just so many different factors, and we really need to look at the whole of elevating our consciousness into that space in order to get over this hump. Is that right? Is that what I heard right?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Of course, like it's not possible that we all become experts in systems thinking. And, this is just way outside of the scope of the individual, but it is still important to think about systems in that way, I believe. One challenge that I see is we have to resist this temptation to see technology as a solution to these problems, because it's often sold like that. Smart city and these terms are really in this category where we think that just we have to introduce a new technology in order to address these problems. The way how I see the role of technology is that it's really like a language. It's something that we can use to discuss things on a broader scale that goes beyond the capacity of a, let's say, face-to-face meeting or town hall, make a forum that is more inclusive. But this temptation to say the Hyperloop or some futuristic new technology will solve all these problems for us, I think that this expectation is actually part of the problem rather than just being not very effective.
Yeah, it's pretty big here in the Silicon Valley scene to think that the technology can solve things. One of the popular beliefs is that if we just go to Mars, we'll solve everything. Do you think we'll solve all these problems if we just go to Mars? We can just bring all the trash, put all the trash.
I'm sure, yeah. Let's do the trash to Mars. That sounds good.
No, it's crazy how pervasive it is. I mean, technology can really do a lot. Like, I think there's definitely a lot in technology. I'm definitely a technophilic person, but I mean, we're humans as well. I mean, human beings are creating the technology. So it's not external to us. It is very much like something that we make to solve our problems. Which brings me on to this one phrase that you said in one of your videos where you talked about cyber utopianism. I mean, do you think cyber utopianism is a thing? I mean, what are your thoughts about that word and what it means?
Well, of course, I was also something that I was inspired by maybe 20, 30 years ago. There is a certain, I think now I'm 44, so I'm looking at things slowly in this kind of historical perspective. I was involved in digital media and internet media art and experimental technologies pretty much since the early 1990s. So I went with this technology through these different phases. And in the beginning, it was very much about speculating about how how would the world change through all these possibilities. But about 15 years ago or so, I started changing the way how I ask these questions, because I saw that, it already has changed so much, and society has embraced all these things. And I thought that actually it's much more interesting to look at how people are using technologies and how technology is deployed in all these different parts of society, and what are the social and political questions that are connected to it. So rather taking a very close look at what is happening at the moment, instead of speculating about something in the future, because the future has already happened. What exists right now is much more complex and interesting than what a futurist could imagine.
Yeah, it's definitely something I notice in Silicon Valley, is just thinking, I know I said it before, but we can focus on imagine these technologies. But one thing that I feel is left out of the traditional engineering mind or the computer science mind, I studied engineering myself. We definitely did not think about the social construct of technology or how people used it. In the Silicon Valley scene, it's very much about the technology, but not as much about like the questions you said are the real questions we need to be asking is how is the technology sort of interacting with people, and how are we going to use it to create the world that we want to create?
Yeah,
Sorry,
no,
Yeah.
absolutely. I mean, this is absolutely my opinion, and there's nothing bitter or critical about that, because engineers who produce certain technologies, they have a certain perspective. Other people have a different perspective. So nobody really has the complete picture, but it's about constructing this understanding of the relationship, society and technology through conversations, through exchange, and I don't expect an engineer to be able to understand all the political subtleties of how their product plays out in the real world. But at the same time, I also don't imagine that a social scientist understands all the technological difficulties. Although, like a lot of people become more transdisciplinary and work in different realms. So there's definitely sees more mutual understanding emerging.
I think that's where innovation really comes from, like with the concept of creativity. I was just writing an essay the last week on why we need to get more into creativity, and a whole section of it is on being cross-disciplinary, bringing different domains together. What you're passionate about is bringing these two domains together. I mean, that's really where innovation's at, the confluence of all these different niches. I wanted to ask you, what is the one thing that gets you really excited? Like the one thing when you wake up, when you sort of think about the most exciting thing about what you do that makes you excited to get out of bed, and you're like, oh, it's one thing that really tickles you, about your work. What is that?
It's funny because you always go through these cycles. When you are really focused on one topic, at some point you are so fed up with it and you don't want to deal with it anymore. And you
the
think,
creative cycle.
Exactly. I'm going to look at something completely different, but then you recognize something random, and you are reminded of why you feel attached to your research field and to your research topics. So it's always something different, but you're always looking at the world through your own lens, and then you always notice things that remind you why what you're doing is relevant.
Okay, but what is it? You didn't
What
answer the question.
I didn't say it.
Yeah.
I mean, last time, for example, one of the recent things was that when I shortly after finished the manuscript to this book, got a call from United Nations. They wanted me to work on kind of urban data projects in Kosovo and Moldova. It's so exciting to be able to do those things actually in the real world. And it's very interesting to suddenly be able to use these kind of data methodologies to tackle a real world problem.
Yeah, there's definitely thrills, I think, in real change. I mean, just coming back to this book that I've been writing, one of the things I'm trying to inspire in the audience is that when you get the strategy right to create real and measurable change in the real world, not just like a fantasy of change, because you create a festival and you think that the festival changed, but you actually make change. I mean, it's remarkable how inspiring and exciting that is. I mean, it really does give you that toe-tingling, exciting feeling that like, wow, I can actually use this to influence the world. Which, as you said, it seems to be the thing that you've been writing, the wave of inspiration you've been recently writing.
Exactly, and with Trash Track, this was the most beautiful part of this project. All these emails that we got from people who were inspired by the project and wanted to try it out in their own town. All these feedback changed the project a lot, because initially we worked with volunteers because we needed a way of getting a good sample so that we can distribute the sensors throughout the city. The passion of the volunteers became such an important element of the project that we didn't initially anticipate. It really changed the project. After the project was finished, super inspiring for me.
Yeah, and that just happens when, you're doing something that works, I think, which is something that's just so cool about getting this stuff right. This is my favorite question to ask everybody, which is, if there was one thing that you could change in the world related to your work, or one thing that you could achieve in your career looking back, like one win, what would you choose? What would you choose it to be?
Oh, this is the hardest question. I don't know.
It is, but it's fantastic. I love it. I
don't know. Maybe I would basically install a light switch on every street light so you can just turn it on and off. It would be fun. But no, sorry. Maybe I cannot really seriously answer that question.
Well, okay. What about just one thing that you think would be fun to do? Maybe not the big win, but something, if there could be one change in the world that would have a big effect on everything. Like one log that you could kick that would be like, if we could just kick that log, so much other stuff would happen.
Yeah, this is such a hard question. I can't answer it. I'm sorry.
You're not going to answer it? Okay. Down with my favorite question. He's not going to answer it. Okay. Well, I'm just going to end with the other part of my favorite question, which is, in 100 years in the future, where would you see the type of work that you're doing? Or where would you like it to be? In the best possible scenario, where would the world be in 100 years?
In the best possible scenario. Well, all we do is really just a tiny bit. I'm too realistic to really, if you look at the way how research works, it's always just such a incremental and long-term thing to get things done. And
well, what about the field? What about if we narrow it in a little bit and say, what about the field of urban data or urban legibility? Where would you see that in 100 years in its best possible incarnation?
In the best or in the most realistic one? Bruce Sterling wrote a lot about that situation that you have once you pretty much know where everything is in the world. If every object is somehow addressable and we have this kind of pervasive awareness. And I think we are definitely going in this direction, but it's definitely not necessarily always a positive scenario. At MIT, people spoke a lot about smart dust. Sensors become as small as dust particles, pervasive understanding of everything, but it's also a very scary thing for me. Yeah, it is hard. There's always this notion of be careful what you wish for. It might become true, but then you find out that it's actually not that great.
So you're really passionate about urban legibility and using data and understanding for decision making, but you're also can see that it can be negative and also scared of this future. You see it in these two different, both this really exciting positive light and also this potentially negative light. So there's this dualism in what you do.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. And if you look at the whole way how people also talk about legibility, like sometimes it's very easy to use this in a very authoritarian way and really just another word for global surveillance. But on the other hand, it's also about making sense of what is around you and making sense of your environment. And so there's this tension, definitely always see.
Well, this has been a really interesting conversation because I've been coming from the worldview that just the more data, the better, the more transparent, the better. And the more that we have, the more that we can start to change everything for the better. I was seeing it in a bit more of a black and white way. And since speaking to you, it seems to just have so many more dimensions to the complexity of trying to save the world, which is what we're talking about here today. Thank you so much for joining me today, Dietmar. That was really, really interesting. If you would like to watch this interview on YouTube, you can find it on the YouTube channel, How to Save the World. And if you want to listen to it on podcast, you can find it on iTunes. And make sure that you sign up to my website, katiepatrick.com. There's a bunch of free resources there that you can subscribe to get more design techniques, behavior, data science techniques to apply to your environmental or social change project. Thanks again so much, everybody, for listening. And I hope this interview today helped turn your passion for how to make the world a better place into real and measurable change.